We're not live yet, but thank you for being here. This is being live broadcast on the Atlanta Council website, so you can all watch it again. Well, welcome. I'm Landon Darrence. I'm the Vice President of Energy and Infrastructure at the Atlanta Council, and I'm excited to pull together this event today on carbon advantage, industry efforts to advance a robust and verifiable accounting framework. There's certainly something in the air here in New York City, and I welcome those that are joining us online as well. Around UNGA, around Climate Week, and that has to do with the development of a carbon accounting framework and its importance for tangible emissions reductions. Judging from the community here, I imagine equally online, it's an important issue that many people have already told me they've been hearing buzz around or have been at events for throughout the week. But what is it? How will it work? Are we sure it will have an impact? We're going to break that down today. And it's important to recognize this isn't only a U.S. story. It's international in nature too. As we look towards COP30 in Brazil this coming November, discussions around Article 6, discussions around carbon markets, there's a growing recognition of the need for carbon accounting and the dialogue around carbon accounting as a major component of the energy and climate space. It's clear this momentum has some deep roots, and we're excited to bring some real strong leadership together to have a conversation around it today. We'll start out the event by two keynotes, one with Marina Patella, who's head of Carbon Accounting Coordination Unit in the Brazilian Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and Alex Kaiser, a friend and the Executive Vice President and Executive Director of H2DI, EFI Foundation. And following those remarks, we'll have a moderated panel by yours truly, along with Kevin Burns, Vice President, Center of Emissions Excellence with S&P, Vijay Swarup, who is the Senior Director of Climate Strategy and Technology at ExxonMobil, and Karthik Ramana, who is not only the co-founder, but with the great title of Principal Investigator of the E-Liabilities Institute. Today's event would not be possible, however, without a collaboration that I'm really excited about. And so in a moment here, I'm going to invite Clarissa Lenz up to the stage, who's been helping us in her capacity both as part of the Brazilian Center for International Relations and in her capacity as founding partner and chief executive officer of Catavento. It's an exciting topic, a topic that we want to deep dive and honestly just continue to build momentum around a dialogue on the importance and value of carbon accounting. So let's get to work, and it's my pleasure to begin by inviting Clarissa to stage to provide some framing remarks. Clarissa?
So good afternoon. For those who don't know me, Landon has kindly introduced myself, so let me introduce myself as well, Landon. In addition to your remarks, I'm Clarissa Lenz. I'm based in Brazil, Rio. I'm here both representing SEBRE, which is the think tank partnering today with the Atlantic Council, and I'm the chair of the energy program there. And I also am the CEO and founder of Catavento Consultancy based in Rio, whose work is dedicated to the energy and climate space. And I'm here together with Bruna Mascotti, senior partner of Catavento as well. So many thanks for the opportunity to contribute to this very important topic. It's been, I guess, a hot topic since I joined on Sunday here in New York for the Climate Week. And it's my pleasure to have SEBRE as a knowledge partner this afternoon. As you mentioned, Landon, the COP30 presidency, hereby represented by Marina Pitella, has identified the harmonization of carbon accounting standards as a key cross-cutting issue for the COP30 action agenda, recognizing its central role in advancing implementation, mainly to unlock low-carbon markets. The topic is rather technical, but it is fundamental to laying the foundation of a low-carbon economy. After all, societies, governments, and companies can only manage what they are able to measure. So over the past months, Catavento partnered with SEBRI and working in to contribute to this agenda also on behalf of the COP30 presidency. And we've been engaging with many of you by interviewing, but also putting many thoughts together. We organized a very robust roundtable in July back in Rio, but also remotely. And some of the findings I'd like to share with you. The first one is that definitely carbon accounting should increasingly shape market forces, either trade flows, either the way that we measure product competitiveness tends to be highly influenced by emission profiles. We also have to acknowledge that there are several initiatives on the way. Responsible Steel, voluntary one for the steel industry, defining low carbon steel. Climate clubs, also government-led, trying to also define standards for low carbon steel and cement. But also on behalf of the Brazilian G20 presidency last year, for instance, IEA also worked on defining low carbon fuels. So we can identify both voluntary but also regulatory initiatives. Nonetheless, we still lack today aligned rules to truly leverage low carbon markets. Multiple frameworks coexist with no agreement around key factors such as emission factors, system boundaries, co-product accounting. So this fragmentation is not helpful because it creates inconsistencies, limits comparability, and hinders policy alignment. Therefore, we understand, we know, we acknowledge that we need to progress. Although we should not look for perfection, we know that we have to urgently advance product level carbon intensity system development. We also would like to do this by remaining technology neutral. This is important, and I guess that Mariana might mention a few words about it. Interoperability may be more realistic than full harmonization. We acknowledge that. But for an emerging economy such as Brazil, there are a couple of aspects that should also be taken into consideration. We should avoid the data availability gaps are still present. They need to be addressed. We also should avoid that unintended trade barriers for emerging economies are based also on carbon intensity, so that we recognize the fairness and equity issues. And we should definitely include solutions coming from tropical agriculture, biogenic removals, and bioenergy in global mitigation efforts. So therefore, we present to the COP30 presidency 3 main recommendations out of this process. The first one was that it establishes a clear objective of what are the intentions around carbon accounting at COP30 and beyond. And I'm sure that Marina will share with us a few of these objectives with defined deliverables and a strong private sector, public-private sector engagement and partnership. Second, we believe that this is a momentum, and this full-packed room is a strong signal to acknowledge the need for globally aligned frameworks that are needed to unlock carbon markets, reaffirming the role also of carbon intensity standards and shared principles. And as we know that this might take longer than we would like, we also suggested the establishment of a technical expert panel that would benefit from the different expertise that are already spreading in many regions and in many domains, such as academia, think tanks, but also the private sector. These expert panels should have clear governance, timeline, and deliverables, bringing together a diverse group of experts. So in this context, I believe that today's event should help to advance some of these recommendations in addition to others, and also helping clarify the problem statement that we have ahead of us. And it's my pleasure to continue this conversation, to invite Marina Pitella to the floor. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, Clarissa. Thank you, the Atlantic Council and SEBRI for organizing this event. It's a very timely one. I want to start sharing from the perspective of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Brazil, how we developed our thinking and ultimately now decided to actually establish a new unit within the structure of the Secretary of Climate, Energy and Environment dedicated to have an overarching view for carbon accounting and carbon markets. In 2024, Brazil held the presidency of the G20, and in through two of those work streams, the one dedicated for energy transition and another for bioeconomy, the issue of how you frame carbon accounting methodologies, how inconsistent they are, and how the fragmentation of those frameworks was actually impairing real climate action was brought forward. In the case of energy transition, our focus at the time was for sustainable fuels. We counted with the support of IEA, who produces two reports on the commission, by the Commission of the Brazilian G20 presidency. And building on that work, we have been throughout 2025 really building up in this agenda of sustainable fuels and how actually to unlock the potential. There are challenges and there are inconsistencies that are hampering their full usage, but we identified that this was not enclosed to the energy domain, and especially for the whole spectrum of bioeconomy. And the case of Brazil, particularly, we have a history of engagement with the agro-energy sector and other solutions that involve biogenic carbon. This was a key issue, and more importantly, at the particular juncture that we are as country and as government. So we passed last year legislation on domestic compliance ETS. We are now in the rollout for this ETS. So we will need to establish MRV systems, and we're facing with challenges regarding data collection. This actually has very overarching implications that covers really the whole spectrum of real implemented climate action. So in the context of the Brazilian presidency of COP30 and of really working towards an implementation COP, towards identifying those levers that really lead to real climate actions, we identified the goal of harmonization of carbon markets and carbon accounting standards as a cross-cutting issue. We have been very privileged to count with many partners that have supported us throughout this journey, very knowledge partners. So I think Catavento also for producing strategic reports that informed our work on this. We had roundtables, and we actually very much acknowledge what it is out there. So we're not starting from the scratch. There are important initiatives that have been active in this field. I know that we have representatives from the Climate Club here. We have also IFCMA working on this, but we really wanted to use the COP30 momentum to bring this forward. So I want to share with you also how this work has been developed in the context of the action agenda. Back in June, COP30 President Ambassador André Correia do Lago unveiled his letter on the framework of the action agenda, which is structured around 30 objectives, as was mentioned previously. And we have established for each of these objectives an activation group that are formed by initiatives that are already active in this space. And for this goal in particular, we have invited, we're working with 3 streams. So we have invited countries that are either implementing the journey of implementing, such as Brazil, but or other countries who already have compliance carbon markets to come together and actually to bring a political call for the importance of carbon pricing and the challenges also that it comes with establishing compliance carbon markets. We just held this morning a roundtable on this where we explored an acceleration plan on how bring this open coalition, and this was backed by an important work by a group of economists, an advisory council that was put up by the COP30 the call by the COP30 president, and it has a very strong academic and really strategic thinking behind this. And one of the challenges that was also identified, if you want to have a coalition for countries that will work in a long-term vision of carbon markets integration, that they should have common frameworks, or at least an interoperability or common understandings on how to measure and how to assess carbon. So we have put the question of harmonization. This is the word that we have been using, and the meaning is really looking for a convergence, looking for a common understanding, common ground. And because when we are implementing carbon markets as a cap and trade, that it's going to be in Brazil, it really is of the essence that we determine how we measure at facility level, how we measure that product level. And we have been identified these challenges, consistencies that I'm sure that we'll hear in a much better way from our panel later on. So we have called those countries to implement and to join us into this open coalition. But we also want to release an acceleration plan on carbon accounting, and this counting with the engagement as a multi-stakeholder fashion, because then we identified that this is not something that we could do as governments ourselves. It has to come with the engagement of the industry. It has to come with the engagement of academia. It has to come with the engagement of think tanks that actually have identified those issues. And we are very fortunate that in Brazil we also have a strong community that is looking into those things and looking at the realities that we have in Brazil and other developing countries, and how actually you need to portray these local realities, and also that all the mitigation pathways are open. So the question of technology neutrality is an important one for us. The question of actually for reaching the goals of the Paris Agreement, we need to explore all the pathways for decarbonization, but we have to do it in a way that can be trusted, that ensures environmental integrity, and that actually has a minimum of conversions between sectors, so that we can actually evaluate across the value chain. So we really make this call for the initiatives and partners that are active to collaborate with us into this action plan. And the idea of the whole action agenda, the proposal that is set out, is really to have a framework up until 2028, when we will be reviewing the GST. So it's not a work that will be ending at COP30, but actually we want to really set this process up in dialogue with the initiatives. So I thank you very much for the opportunity of sharing. And again, thank you for the Atlantic Council and SEBRI for organizing the event today. Thank you.
Hello, everybody. I will be quick so we can get to the panel that we're all very excited to hear from. I'm Alex Kaiser. I'm with the EFI Foundation. Going to talk a little bit about our work to kind of kick up a little dust before we hop over to the panel. At EFI Foundation, we focus at the nexus of technology, policy, and business, which sounds great. At the middle of that nexus, at the center of the center, is how you count carbon. We believe and have found through our work, if we can't measure it and account for it, we can't address it. And this is driving a lot of the work that we've been doing over the last few years, from the hydrogen demand initiative that Landon mentioned to a nuclear scaling project that we're currently undertaking. Something that we've learned over the last year, especially when we got really into implementation in the Biden administration, is just how difficult it is to scale a new industry without clear accounting rules. And this is something that we're really trying to take to heart, and we're trying to address in a few of the projects. think for us, the point is very clear that you can't unlock the needed investment on any reasonable time scale and allow companies to compete on performance without a shared, trusted measurement system for carbon. Well, for many things for that matter, but especially for carbon. So we're working with partners on a new system where we're pairing together two things. It's pretty simple, I promise. How do you take financial accounting style principles that run the global economy, help run the global economy, and science? Namely, how do we track all carbon using mass balance processes to make sure that all the carbon is counted and only once? What a novel idea. A few additional quick points on our work. We think that product-based carbon accounting can trigger a virtuous cycle that we're very excited about. And this is something that I learned firsthand during some of the hydrogen demand work that Landon again mentioned, as well as I think we're seeing in other projects as well. So where you can value it and measure it, especially in places like the United States that have a competitive advantage, especially in our manufacturing efficiency, then we can start to value it and really trigger that virtuous cycle that I mentioned. Another thing about our work that we find to be extremely important is separating the accounting from the reporting from the policy. Again, it seems so obvious, but it's something that a lot of other so-called carbon accounting approaches don't often recognize. And blurring those lines can be very difficult as you start to add a little bit more on the dials for the accounting system. It hurts trust and it impacts the ability for us to understand and count all the carbon, again, only once. The last thing I'm going to mention about our approach is that we're really focused on how can we adopt financial accounting like principles. Think about these as close to immutable guidelines that are slow to change, that we can all agree on, and it'll take probably years of industry-led support to agree on those principles. But you want to pair that with something like a rule book that could be somewhat of a living document that can help support implementation. And the relationship between those principles and a rule book we think is very important for the next phase of this carbon accounting discussion. One more thing I'm going to say before a few other things is that it doesn't feel like it, but the time for action is now. All of the policy issues are obvious and have been the topic of many events that you guys have been at, of course. But it will take years for the right coalition to emerge, and we think, led by industry, there's a lot of analogy sectors that have done something similar that I'm sure will come up during the panel discussion, to align on those core principles. And so we're starting right now, or we've already started. So at EFI, we're actively publishing a series of reports that build on many of these ideas that I've mentioned, and then I think you're going to hear from the panel today. I think as policy people at EFI, we're really focused on how to reduce these high-level concepts to practice, because we know how you show these approaches will interact in the real world is so important to get policymakers aligned, which I think is a first fast next step. I think the stakes also could not be higher. The next few years are going to be critical for major industries to align on these basic principles that I keep mentioning. China's delivering over 100 product carbon intensity standards, and the EU is soon rolling out its CBAM rules, as I'm sure a lot of you know. And so will the United States and American companies be leaders in this process or be forced to comply with the structures developed abroad? I'll skip some stats, but because I want to get to the panel, but I will say we owe a ton of credit to the legacy systems that we use today that help to drive especially voluntary markets for action. And they're really important, especially to help policymakers, again, get arms around the problem more. But what we need something is really fit for purpose, and that purpose is to unlock the investment that I mentioned. And we need something like, depending on who you ask, $9 trillion per year of new investment in low carbon to reach anything close to deep decarbonization. And so to do that, we want something that has this, adopted principles from something that drives economic activity and support across the world, financial accounting with those kind of core structures, that I mentioned on carbon mass balances. And so that's where what we think and what we call comprehensive carbon accounting, something we're really excited to continue to partner with a lot of the folks on the panel and in this room on, and just really looking forward to keeping the discussion going. Thank you.
Thanks, Alex. Thanks, Marina and Clarissa. I'd like to invite our panelists up to the stage here. We just grab one of these seats and we'll get to a discussion. I need to make sure you match the brand so you know you're with the Atlanta Council of Global Energy Center. Look, the three of you, I know personally, and I know you're not bashful, so I want you to feel free to jump in and have the conversation. I'll guide it, but you lead it where you think we need to go as well. We've had a couple framing remarks, both from a government perspective of how this can fit into global climate frameworks, from Alex and EFI in terms of some of the thinking about how they can approach carbon accounting and why they're doing it. But I want to simplify it for 1 second and start with Kevin on the far side of the panel here, just by setting a baseline. There's different frameworks, different priorities, different stakeholders. You've been thinking about the emission space for quite some time. How do you define carbon accounting? Like, what is this for people?
A couple of years ago, it would have been a lot easier because there would have been 3 people in the room. And we could probably align it. I think about it as when you think about it's not just a product in my mind for carbon accounting, but I think the focus here is product. But it is about how do you quantify an asset or a system or a product. And what I mean by that in terms of like when you think about an asset, you draw a circle around something, put a fence around something. What is the emissions that are being produced in that facility and or imported in that facility, such as power? And there's different ways to do that. And that's because the rules that we have in terms of the standards and protocols that exist, they're good. But they're designed to be intentionally vague, to be applicable across sectors, and to be internally consistent through time. So you have comparability through your own ability to reduce your emissions. So I think it's the ability to quantify a defined space, a defined physical activity, or a defined product for me. That's what it is. And I know Vijay would go into the stoichiometry and the math of it, but I'm trying to keep it fairly simple here. And there's a lot of complexity that goes into those systems. You can think about a refinery, for example, have multiple processes, multiple sources of point source emissions, but also multiple points of combustion and heat use, as well as the concern associated with fugitives. So it's very hard to get an understanding of those systems and the emissions that occur, but that's how I define it, is articulating the methodology that you put into the process to define the emission that exists in that space. And I think we can do that today. Now there's varying degrees of quality, but I'll leave that for another question.
Well, but I mean, Vijay, Karthik, I'm going to be interested to see you build on how Kevin's framing this. But you know, in that same context, Karthik, I want to talk about the why, not just what this is, but why is there even a need for change? You've been, pretty articulate, in my opinion, over time about how there are maybe some shortfalls in the current system today. A lack of precision, a need for true accountability. What do you see as the main shortcoming in today's system, and what technical solutions are needed to deliver change?
Yeah, I mean, you start with your first question about what is the definition of accounting, right? I mean, everything material should be counted. It should be counted only once, and it should be allocated to a product. You teach this on the first day of an accounting class, undergraduate, graduate, doesn't matter. And if you look at those 3 core principles that are heart of accounting, we've used them in the financial accounting system since Luca Pacioli invented double entry bookkeeping system 600 years ago. And all 3 of those principles are missing in the way we currently go about this. In fact, my first reaction when I admit that I only first read the Greenhouse Gas Protocol in 2021 or 2020, thereabouts. Until then, I was not paying attention to this area at all. And it said carbon accounting on the front. And when I read it, it didn't look like anything that you would call accounting, because accounting is a body of knowledge. It's had 600-year history, but in fact, it goes back to 3,000 years, well before that. And what it is we call carbon accounting today is not accounting. So that's where I come from on this. I mean, at the very basic level, there is what we call the information problem. You know, most companies don't know the identities of their suppliers, let alone know what their embedded emissions will be in the products they buy from them. The idea that you would look 8, 10, 20 layers up your supply chain or down your value chain and somehow divine what the emissions there are, that's just fanciful. I mean, you don't even know the identity of them. How are you going to get the data? So that's the information problem. By the way, this information problem economists have talked about, again, for hundreds of years. It's not new insight. The second problem we have is what we call a control problem, right? I mean, companies can control what it is the purchases they make. They can control their direct emissions. They can't necessarily control what their customers do with their products. They can't certainly control what their customers' customers do with their products, and so forth. So there's a control problem there as well. And that's why accounting tends to be historic and looks backward rather than prospective. And in financial markets, we make the distinction between accounting and disclosure for that reason. This is to say that there is a very important role for disclosure in markets, for information markets, prospective information, but it's very separate from the role of accounting, which is a truing up mechanism. It's a truth-telling mechanism in markets. So that's the second problem. Third problem is the multiple counting problem, right? So you look at it and you say the same number is counted, not twice, double, because people often use the shorthand double counting. But if it's double counting, it'd be easy to undo, right? It's trivial to undo. The problem is it's multiple counting, and it's counted an arbitrarily multiple number of times. So it's very difficult to unravel that, and so that's nonsense as a result. And then the final problem we've got with this is multiple accounting, which is to say that many companies in the value chain are doing the same thing. You know, for those of you who have government experience, any kind of public policy requires to have a cost-benefit analysis. And this would just fail the basic cost-benefit analysis test, because you're saying the same exercise has to be repeated multiple times in the value chain. So you start, yeah, I mean, I'm going to stop here in the interest of time, but you start sort of looking at all the things we've learned in accounting, in the practice of accounting, and they're missing in the status quo. So if we're serious about this, to your question about why, well, if we're serious about decarbonization, well, we've got to solve this problem. We start with this.
So if I was to reverse engineer a little bit that, your three inputs highlight current policy frameworks that try to use the system as it is are not going to achieve the outcome that you think we ultimately are aiming for in this community here.
No, absolutely not. I mean, and we've so many lessons in history from this. Let's say, for example, that you don't like what tobacco companies do, right? Does that mean that you change the rules of accounting for tobacco companies in order to get the policy outcome you want? Of course not. You know, you want the same accounting rules, and then you build a policy on it. Yep. So the idea that you would subvert the nature of accounting in order to accomplish your policy is absurd. It connects back to what we heard earlier about, you know, I mean, accounting has to be ideologically agnostic. It has to be policy agnostic. And there's a great book that I point you to by a friend of mine, Jacob Soll, who's a historian, is a MacArthur Award-winning historian, who wrote a book called The Reckoning. And it's about the collapse of civilizations. And he says the thing that results in civilizational collapse is the collapse of a system of accountability within that society. So it stops telling the truth to itself. And so if we're serious about this problem, well, we've got to have a reckoning of what it is we're doing.
So Vijay, I do want to bring you in here.
Yeah, could you let me go before him next time?
Because Kevin, you can jump on top of Vijay's thoughts on this. No, but I want to talk about obviously the industry perspective, but in particular, how are we talking about emissions from a liability to an opportunity? Because if what Karthik's articulating, which is a system that lacks comparability, that maybe at moments is convoluted, it ends up ultimately lacking utility. And so what you need as a business is some certainty and an opportunity to harness a market opportunity around this. What is so attractive about carbon accounting in that context?
Yeah. Well, first off, thank you for this. And I've been doing this a long time. I've always wanted to say this in one of these meetings. Can you hear me in the back? Because there's never been a back, okay? I mean, this is just exciting, okay?
This is very true.
Right, exactly,
Very true.
right? I mean, this is unbelievable. So thank you all for coming and giving us your time. And again, thank you for the opportunity here. Look, what do businesses want to do? We want to compete. We want to compete and win. And we want to compete and win on a level playing field. It's pretty simple. And it's not about solutions, it's about defining the problem. That's what engineers do. We define problems. Let's make it the problem right. The world needs energy. We haven't said that yet. The world needs energy, and the world needs to reduce emissions. We all agree on that problem statement? Yes. Okay. If we all agree on that problem statement, let's come up with an accounting system that drives competition, that drives innovation, that drives technology deployment, that allows us to track emissions reductions while meeting energy demand, bringing in the economists that say, well, that's your affordability, okay? So don't stress the system. Don't set a spec that's unachievable, because guess what? You limit supply. Well, why would you limit supply if we're not able to meet demand today? So we're making this really complicated when it's pretty simple. Meet supply, meet demand. Don't limit supply, which is another way to say be technology agnostic. Make sure you're bending the emissions curve. Allow regions to decide what shape they want to go. But trade is critical. Trade is critical. And you've got to have commonality. You've got to have consistency. So it's 4 or 5 things. It's based on, as you all said, it's based on financial principles. And thank goodness for chemists, because it is all about systems and material and energy balances. That's the truth in this. The truth in this is a CH meets an O and turns into a CO2. And you know when and where it happened. And therefore you can account for it. So that's what we're trying to do, Landon. But look, we want to compete. We want to compete on a level playing field, and we want the best technology to win.
I just want to take off on that. Just the way I think about it is when you buy and sell a good, right? It's the product attributes that are fundamental to buyers and sellers transacting, right? So when you buy anything, that thing you're purchasing delivers some sort of utility, right? They brought me a bottle of water because I'm thirsty. It's going to make me.
I didn't get one.
Yeah, VJ wants one too now. But
Well, this is being live streamed. I appreciate that. Thank you.
So that understanding between a buyer and seller to be able to transact and assign value to the utility, and one of the utilities I think we're talking about that society has said they do value is the environmental implication, the greenhouse gas implication. And for two people to meet and make that transaction, they have to first agree what does it look like, what is the relative carbon intensity, and they also have to agree to trust that information, that it's worthy of me spending money or transacting preferentially for something that's deemed to be lower carbon. What we have now is we have a lack of product attribute definition, or we have a plethora of different definitions of product attribute depending where you go in the world. And so for buyers and sellers to transact, how are they supposed to decipher different information being provided by different people? And in the system right now, they're not doing anything fundamentally wrong. They're following the rules and the guidance. But without that clarity, how can we ever expect society or people to make a choice to assign a value to it? And I don't think it necessarily translates to a massive change in valuation. That's not what I believe will occur. This is, and I'm going to channel my former economist side, this is about solving for supply and demand, right? If you have a preferential product in the market, in this case it's lower carbon, it delivers the same utility, so VJ sells oil, I sell oil, let's say, we're both selling oil and I have a lower carbon product. Preferentially, Karthik's going to come to me and buy my good more. Up to the point I go to Karthik, you know what, I can't do it. I'm full out. You got to pay me a little more and I can go get some more for you, or I can go to VJ. That's a choice. At that point, he's going to assign value into that transaction and whether it's worthy. But right now, Karthik can't tell us apart. And that's the problem.
By commoditizing carbon, you decommoditize everything else, right? You decommoditize oil, you decommoditize steel, you decommoditize cement, and that's the beauty of this, that you basically create a market for carbon and let the market then solve the problem.
Okay, but a real question on that then. Will carbon accounting itself then send a market signal sufficient to actually achieve the emissions benchmarks that maybe people in the climate community here today would be interested in?
That's an empirical question. My instinct is that it will not. I mean, if you have decided from the top down that the threshold is 1.5, I would be surprised if that is where the market equilibrium lands up. It'll probably end up something higher than that, maybe 2, maybe 2.2, whatever it is. But it will land up at some range. Now, you still have an information system to decide as a political process whether you want to sort of bring that down through further regulation, et cetera. So
there's
that's
a
why
temporal element to this as well,
Yeah.
and I think Vijay,
Well, yeah.
as a person in industry, you get the inertia behind a market.
Yeah, but let's go back to basics. You need an accounting system that is globally harmonized, right? You can't have 2 different accounting systems. But that's actually not what you guys were talking about. You guys were talking about how do you actually lower the product intensity, which is actually how you decarbonize. The accounting system is just the records. The key is I have a product that's X today and I need to bring it down, and that's, we call it product emissions intensity or carbon emissions intensity. And that's really the knob that you're turning. And that rate at which it's going to come down should be driven by the speed of science, not by the speed of anything else. So as technology, and what you want is you want the policy to drive that technology. And before you say, well, what about policy? Policy better know how to get to a market, because you can't have policy forever. So policy drives market, technology drives scale. And if we're all rowing in the same direction, and then you have a common accounting framework so that everybody's comparable, and you're all doing the calculations the same way, now we can actually have a conversation on what the technologies are. We can actually drive competition and drive global trade, which is ultimately, that's the usefulness of this, right? If you can't do those things, then this is just another academic exercise that I don't think any of us are interested in doing. Sorry.
Landon, let's turn this around and let's talk about where the world's going right now, right? Right now, we have countries trying to increase stringency, drive decarbonization through policy, send a market signal by creating carbon markets. That's the right thing to do, right? But it leads you to an inevitable conclusion when you look at the world. Right now, most global emissions are not priced, right? I think it's like 72% of global emissions. We say about 28% covered when we analyze it. So you turn that around, it leads a nation that wants to increase that stringency to an inevitable conclusion. One, they need to stop increasing their stringency, otherwise they harm the competitiveness of their domestic industry. Or two, I need to insulate my industry by trying to project something internationally. Extraterritorial measures become attractive. And we've seen a proliferation of CBAMs, not just Europe, other people looking at this measure. If you have a proliferation of CBAM-like policies with inconsistent, I'd call it quantification, that's where I break between accounting. I'm more on the quant side, these guys are more on the accounting side, Vijay's right in the middle. But like, the point is, if you have inconsistent quantification, what happens? You have market trade distortions, and you have difference agreements between countries. It's hard for them to align on trade at that point because you have them applying different standards internationally, and that's really problematic. And for companies like multinationals that have to comply in multiple regions, you have a proliferation of compliance markets with different requirements to report against. They're spending a lot of money on compliance, not on decarbonization. So we're not solving for the original problem, we're doing other things. And so I just want to add that in.
No, Kevin, I want to stick with you on this because, Marina did talk about, from the Brazilian government's perspective, the importance of harmonization. And so let's park policy for a second, because I think you're right. When we're building towards a robust carbon accounting framework, that is ultimately policy agnostic. That's a quantifiable benchmark for where emissions are and how they're moving through our economies. But I like what you pointed out. It's not a policy framework around carbon accounting. It's that people are applying policy to have a competitive advantage around emissions. And I think that that's leading to a proliferation of many different efforts to account for carbon. So how do we harmonize a backbone of a robust carbon accounting framework? Like, how do we start to centralize what we're actually talking about?
That's a hard question, and I'm glad you've got the COP folks to talk first. I think of it as a couple things. One is that who is best placed to think about the quantification, right? And I do think if you look around the world, like I work for a multinational. We work across sectors. We work at multiple industries. And each one of these industries, even within themselves, we may think of it as homogeneous. It is not. They're incredibly heterogeneous, and the systems they engage in are heterogeneous, and they're tailored to the countries they do business in and the natural infrastructure of those countries, even if they're multinationals. So in this environment, we have to think about, like, where's the expertise, and I'll leave the accounting part for Karthik on this. From a pure quantification, how do I get a similar level of quantification? And I don't think we need perfection. I think we need fudgeability. But those companies are probably best suited to understand that heterogeneity and provide that. They already do this already inside themselves as they adhere to these requirements. I think they're best placed to come up with a way to do the quantification and present it. It doesn't mean they get to say this is the way it is. They need to do this work to present it to governments. And I think ideally it's cross-sectoral, an example of two things where we didn't talk about this, some fundamental differences in quantification. One of them is allocation. And the reason I bring this up, allocation is kind of, it's a nuanced piece, but if you have a process that results in multiple co-products, how you choose to divide, and it's not the proper word, but divide the emission amongst those products is not the same from company to company. They make different choices. You could use it in energy basis, you can use it in mass basis. Different sectors, these make sense. For energy companies, energy makes sense. For mining companies, that doesn't make as much sense. So mass might be a better process. But these decisions need to be vetted through and across different supply chains and presented, I think ideally to government. So we need industry to coordinate to try to do some of this work. There's lots of good work that's already been done. I don't think you need to reinvent the wheel. It's about bringing it together and going through this systematically and providing some demonstrations to government. On the government side, I think they need to figure out what are the principles that underline that work they're looking for? What are we solving for? And then the other side of this is how do they coordinate? I think that's the biggest challenge I see internationally is how do you coordinate on trade right now when it does not look easy looking in it. So I think it's a two to tango. Industry needs to organize and figure out how to move forward cross-sectorally, and governments need to organize and figure out how to work together on this as well.
Vijay, you represent a multinational in multiple jurisdictions. I just want you to reflect on this and maybe articulate what you think industry's role is.
We're going to solve the problem. How's that? I mean, who else is going to do energy at scale? It's going to be us. And so we need to have line of sight to what the technologies are. We have to have the right incentives to go out there and deploy. We know as scale goes up, cost goes down. We know that. We need to start doing it. And so you need a policy construct that allows you to get the first technology deployments. You need to have a system that allows you to understand how the emissions are coming down as the scale goes up. So we just got to focus on the problem. We got to keep providing more energy. There's still 2 billion people out there that don't have access to energy. We have to start there. And we have to bring down the emissions, and we need some systems and measurements and tools that can allow us to make sure we're tracking the progress the right way. There's a couple of things that we just got to keep coming back to. A lot of what's being talked about here is really what you've talked about the first class of accounting, which I don't like to remember. I'm going to talk about the first class in chemical engineering, which is material and energy balances, system boundaries. That's actually what drives this. And we got to keep coming to that. And then the second thing we got to remember is one accounting system, not multiple, and one that represents both company and products, not two, so that you can really do what's needed to be done. It's been done before. It can be done here. These discussions really need to center around the problem we're trying to solve and get the right tools so that we can get on to solving this problem.
Not asking for a specific perspective of ExxonMobil,
Okay?
but do you see this happening in industry? Are people proactively already are the chemists getting to work to make sure, like how developed is this behind the scenes?
Well, look, I had the honor of running our R&D organization for about 10 years, so I can tell you that the research is going on, and I can tell you that the technologies are ready to be deployed. I can also tell you that the technologies are expensive. And here we go again. Policy and technology have to work together. Policy has to have line of sight to the market. Technology has to have line of sight to the scale. So when we're doing carbon capture, when we're doing hydrogen, when we're doing carbon materials, when we're doing whatever we're doing, we are never satisfied. We want to go to the next scale and the next scale and the next scale. We also want to understand what cost curve we're on. We understand what the technology developments are, okay? 38 years I've been around this thing. If you'd have told me we're doing what we're doing today 38 years ago when I started, I'd have said, not a chance, right? We have to unleash technology, and we have to somehow catalyze this technology. And this is a mechanism to catalyze that technology deployment.
Karthik, Kevin articulated two components of this, which was industry and policymakers. Vijay's done a really great job talking about the industry perspective. And I know you don't represent policy, but we don't have a policymaker on this stage right now. And I think in part intentionally, because a lot of the carbon accounting discussions, if there's a will to even discuss it, come with a very bias of the national interest. So if you bring a European policymaker on here right now, it's going to be in the lens of CBAM. I think that distracts from the core issue we're talking about. But I know that you're talking to a lot of policymakers around the world. And I'm curious your reflection on the maturity of that discussion and where this is happening within political circles.
Yeah. So the good news is that there are what we call pull factors that would bring a robust carbon accounting system into play. There were pull factors in the previous administration in this country, and there are pull factors in this administration. They're different pull factors, but they're pull factors nonetheless. In fact, if you read the transcript of the President's remarks from yesterday in the UN General Assembly, the President noted that we have this advantage in clean manufacturing, in clean energy, in clean coal, and he noted that at this time, while the US has done a reasonably good job in managing its emissions, other parts of the world with which US companies compete have not, and those emissions have gone up. And then he used his favorite word, tariff, right? So if you're going to have effectively an emissions-based tariff, then you need a carbon accounting system to drive that into place. That was, by the way, the lesson the Europeans learned. They tried to build a CBAM last year without a carbon accounting system. And it was the opposite of good public policy, because what they did was say, well, we'll try to do this for the few things we can, give you formulas to calculate. And that meant that if you brought in raw materials into the European Union in order to make finished goods, you'd be tariffed. But if you brought in the finished good, you wouldn't be tariffed, which is, why would you do that to your own economy? So now they're taking a step back, and it wasn't even a close vote. The European Parliament voted 539 to 61, right, to say we need a carbon accounting system. And we need to simplify carbon accounting methodology. So there are pull factors, whether it's in the United States, whether it's in Europe, whether it's in China, right? China's going to come with a product carbon accounting system to COP. Other parts of the world are thinking about this as well. And you rightly pointed out that each country is probably going to look at it somewhat opportunistically, right? So in the context of the European Union, there will be an attempt to somehow insulate Polish manufacturing, right? Because Polish manufacturing is very dirty, and the Europeans don't want that to somehow, further contribute to deindustrialization within Europe. In the context of China, there will be an attempt to protect China's manufacturing exports, right? So different countries will embrace, as is sort of the case, by the way, you see this in financial accounting as well, a degree of opportunism. That's why I think that's where industry can play an important role. So one of the things that an industry-led coalition can do, because industry operates on a global scale, is insist on global comparability and insist on carbon accounting rules that are broadly consistent with the laws of physics, right? Energy cannot be created or destroyed. That seems like something that we should be all adhering to in this. So is it going to be a seamless political process? Probably not. Just based on our experience with financial accounting. But there are strong reasons to believe that governments will take this very seriously in the very short term, right? Economic nationalism is here to stay. It is the zeitgeist, not just in this country, but in many countries around the world. And this is a key enabler of that agenda. And there are strong reasons for industry to work to ensure that the carbon accounting rules are roughly consistent with laws of physics, and therefore thermodynamically consistent, therefore what we call consistent with the laws, with rules of causal logic, right? And so I'm actually cautiously optimistic that we can look at a fundamental reimagination of the way we think about carbon accounting in the world in the course of the next few months.
So I do want to pivot now to policy then, because implicitly, the president's remarks yesterday are about United States competitiveness, right? That is based in an administration clearly and actively pursuing a trade agenda where something like this would play probably a pretty pronounced role. So Kevin, if I could bring you in, if we have an objective, verifiable carbon accounting system, we know where the emissions run through our value chain. What tools from a policy lens are we now unlocking? Next step, this is separate from carbon accounting itself, but it's a policy that is enabled by such a system.
I'm more of the quant side, Landon, but I think, I'll give you an example, and I've got one of my colleagues sitting here who's done some great work on methane. And what we find is discovery drives incredible improvement. And I give you the example of methane because the advent of remote sensing technology, I think, is transforming the upstream business. And one of the examples is what we've seen in the Permian. Simply the realization and the reduction in technology costs, and to your point, the cost curve came down on observational technology and the industry started using it because people were telling them they had a problem. The problem is now identified. They can see the problem. And what we've seen is nearly a 50% reduction in that methane intensity coming out of the Permian. Raul can correct me if I'm wrong, but it's startling. And so I think the first thing that will happen from once you have some degree of harmonization and comparability is people will find and be able to make choices. Yeah, I gave the example of supply and demand earlier. I'm not saying it necessarily drives cost and it drives a differential right away. Knowledge will drive preferential choices, longer term contracts, and those are financial things. And then it does allow the ability, that, and I think Karthik talked about this earlier, for governments to come up with policies that align with this and they can drive that behavior. And in supply chains themselves, there's different points on it. Like when we look at supply chains, there's incredible variability exists at every stage. To get a clean or low carbon molecule somewhere, you have to be good all the way through. But it will drive innovation and technology and improvement. And I think Vijay talked about this. Right now, the challenge companies face, if they're faced with how to spend a dollar, that dollar has to perform against an ROI average for that company. And now they can sneak some stuff through lower here and there, but overall, they have a duty to protect shareholder value. If they're asked to make these investments at larger scale, they need those investments have to recoup. You have to be able to get your money back out and demonstrate that value. So the idea here, I think we're talking about, is an alignment. We're asking, what we need is the information to allow parties to transact, and through that transaction, we can assign value. Governments can assign value through policies and regulations and build upon this, but the market may also find value and do that. And in doing that, it unlocks the ability of companies to make these investments and recoup the capital.
I actually think that's an interesting way to ask you the same question, Vijay. Obviously, Exxon's in the business of making money and providing energy. And so what policy framework, what tools are unlocked by this? Because not only do we talk about the utility of carbon accounting from a fairness factor and a stabilizing certainty factor, but it theoretically should be able to unlock new business opportunities and new business streams around a new market with emissions itself.
Well, I mean, look, you want clarity, you want consistency, you want something that you can actually rely on, you want the math to work, and you want the math to be consistent. So if we don't, if you get to that, which you can actually do here, and I love it when my accounting buddy here uses words like stoichiometry and thermodynamics and things like that. That just makes me hope that accountants are going to become chemists. But it really is the marriage of accounting and chemistry, and making sure that the problem statement is the problem statement, and that is more energy, lower emissions, and that we can continue to drive to that, and make sure that we're building a system. Because while methane is a good example, you can actually measure methane. You can't measure CO2. You have to calculate it. You can't take a pen or a piece of steel and say, I'm going to take this into lab and I'll be able to measure the CO2. You can't do that. So you have to be able to calculate it, which means you have to follow the process. And if everybody's just focusing on their little box, and reporting the CO2 that happened while they had the box and pass it on, it's going to work. Just take care of your box. Don't look left, don't look right, just like you're driving in New York. Don't look behind and don't just focus on your, right? Just focus. And if you get that and you pass it along, then you've done something magical. You know exactly what you contributed, call that company's emissions. And you also know the product intensity emissions as it leaves your gate. You get those two things on a constant basis, and chemistry is the same whether you're in China, India, US. Chemistry is chemistry. Stoichiometry is stoichiometry. And if you can get to that, now you have something that actually allows you to understand which technologies deploy, allows competition to be competition, and it actually gets us back to the problem, which is, wow, now we can continue to provide more energy, and we can find ways to lower emissions. And that's really what we should be talking about here.
Karthik, I'm going to go back to you before a general question to the group as we wrap up here today about kind of where we're headed in the trajectory. We've heard from the oil and gas sector, and having Vijay here, I know you've run pilots through the E-Ledgers Institute with other industries. I'm curious the initial makeup of who we really need to be a part of a community to begin to make change on at least one half of the equation that Kevin outlined earlier.
Yeah, so we've worked with beyond energy, cement, steel, even sectors like healthcare, services sectors, end-use retailers, because of course we want the pressure to come from the end-use retailers because they experience, in some sense, the market pressure from consumers. So we've actually worked with a broad cross-section of industries, in part to demonstrate that there's value in doing this, that when you provide this information in the value chain, people change their decisions. And as they change their decisions, that creates the incentive for further research, further product improvements, and so forth. So now, there are only a few industries that account for the vast majority of direct emissions. Basically, if you look at internal combustion engines, external combustion engines, steel, cement, and cows, you get to about 85% of total global emissions. But of course, you can't just sort of focus on those industries and expect the problem will go away, because the demand signals for that come deep downstream. So that's why we work with a broad range. So for instance, we did a pilot recently with a hospital system that was looking at basically the product level emissions intensity with hip replacement surgeries. And in hip replacement surgeries, you have to make a number of different decisions, including how you run your operating theater, et cetera, what kind of anesthetic gases you use, also how you source the artificial hip. And so it's by bringing that information into the decision-making rubric, you then drive a signal through the value chain for people to make different decisions. So for instance, in the case of the hip replacement, the artificial hip, it turns out, moves, so part of it is fabricated in the United Kingdom, then it goes to Germany to get a special coat of paint, then it goes back to the United Kingdom to get polished, then it goes somewhere in Portugal to get another layer. And so, it's just, is there a way to do this more efficiently? That's part of what this information system starts generating, right? So again, the system itself is policy and technology agnostic. But as you start deploying it, and that's why we say the beauty of the system is once you have it, it doesn't matter whether you're doing it for artificial hips or you're doing it for a bag of cement. It's the same principles they're applying throughout. Yeah.
Given its objective nature and application, it seems like something that we can really build a coalition of people like those in this room to get behind carbon accounting, and then we can retrench and think about the policy after,
Yes.
And really encourage that level of motivation now. We've had the opportunity to have the COP30 presidency or the Brazilian government with us today. We're all headed to Belém, Rio, Sao Paulo in November. Starting with Kevin, quick fire. I'm almost out of time here. What are you hoping to see in the progress between now and Belém?
I think first of all, it feels no regrets, in the sense the work that we need to do on harmonizing carbon accounting, it's fundamental, right? Because we don't know, we don't have transparency, and I think people do want transparency and they do want to compare. The things I'm looking for, I think, are signs of the ability to coordinate. Industry getting together and trying to collectively figure out how they work together and collaborate on some of the demonstrations I think need to happen. And then equally, I think looking for governments in terms of giving clarity of what they want to do with this information, how they want to receive this information, and how they want to engage in this space. Those are the things I'm kind of looking for. It's the coordination piece. I think Vijay said this earlier. We know how to do the math, and we do have principles on how to do accounting. There's a little bit more between them to refine. What we need to know is what we're going to do with it and how do we present it.
Vijay?
Well, first I want to thank Clarissa and Marina for putting this on the COP agenda. It's the first time that carbon accounting and harmonized carbon accounting has made it. So congratulations to that, because I think that's an act of leadership that was absolutely needed. And I think it's, let's have a constructive conversation. Let's start with where we agree instead of starting with where we disagree. It's a lot easier to connect yeses than to connect nos. And we actually agree on a lot more. But people like to so let's be constructive. Let's understand the problem statement. Let's take advantage of the fact that the COP is actually welcoming a discussion on carbon accounting. Let industry participate, because we want to solve this problem. We know how to solve this problem. We all got to bring our skills together. This is the capabilities. Let's get all the capabilities working in the same direction and look out, because we know how to innovate. Let the innovation out.
Final word.
Well, between now and COP, I would say that we have one thing that's consistent through all of the remarks that I took away is that if we're serious about the problem, we have to get the measurement right. And so let us double down on that principle, and let us recognize that we're operating in a system where that principle does not apply, and recognizing and paying homage to everything that's been done before. Let's recognize that this is a moment for transformational change. And if we use this COP to deliver that transformational change, that will be the legacy of Brazil for the rest, and the gift of Brazil for the rest of the world. That's what I'd like to see happen.
Gentlemen, thank you so much for joining us. Ladies and gentlemen, from the back of the room that VJ gets to speak to all the way to the front with our guest keynote speakers, thrilled to have you here for this conversation. VJ, I can tell you from the Atlantic Council side, bringing more energy to the world and lowering emissions is something we can get behind. Excited to continue this conversation around carbon accounting. And thank you for everybody in person joining us and those online. For those here, please join us for a reception just outside. And otherwise, let's keep the conversation around carbon accounting going. Thank you.
Thank you.